This week on r/ProRevenge.
I have crippling depression.
Stay till the end to find out what happens when Uncle bankrupts his previous employer. Don't fire me so you can hire your nephew.
Be gone!
This happened several years ago. I was working for a small medical supply company as the IT manager. Business was bad and eventually the IT department had to downsize to just me. During this time they brought in a new CFO that I had to report directly to. Let's call her Pam. Pam had zero knowledge of IT and how things worked. Her motto was if it ain't broke don't fix it. PC, server lifecycles didn't exist. We don't have to pay for licensing to keep our firewall updated, it's working just fine now. I went from having an annual budget to a wish list which she would deny everything I asked for. The couple that owned the company were real pieces of shit too. One time we had a quarterly meeting and people were asking about how secure their jobs were. The owners said that nobody was getting laid off and that our jobs were all secure. This was at 5 p.m. on a Wednesday. The very next morning at 9 o'clock they laid off 6 people. At noon one of the owners showed up to show off the Escalade that he had just purchased that morning. During the first 6 months that Pam was there she started firing everyone that worked for the old CFO and replaced them with her friends and family. 3 of her bridesmaids from her wedding a few years prior got hired to replace those that she fired. I knew I was on borrowed time. After she had been there for 9 months I was the only one left out of what was about a dozen people that worked for the old CFO. I knew my time was running out. I had been looking for work, but the 2009 crash just happened and the job market in my area went south quickly. Sure enough she called me into HR and blindsided me with an entirely trumped up charge that she claimed happened the day before. I was working with the VP of sales on a project that entire day so I had a witness. I asked to bring him in since my boss was lying and was told this is not about him, this is about you. Remember kids, HR is there to protect the business, not do what is right or legal in some cases. Needless to say I knew my days were numbered. The next morning I get introduced to an IT expert who just happens to be Pam's 21-year-old nephew. He was to shadow me and evaluate everything that I did to see if we could streamline any processes. In other words, they wanted me to train him to do my job. I quickly learned that this kid had absolutely no knowledge of IT. He's the kid people think is an IT expert, because he can hook up a PlayStation to a TV. He didn't even know how to join a PC to a domain. So I knew what had to be done. The inventory, billing and shipping and receiving were all run by scripts that I created on the server. They were all run using the domain admin account. I raised quite a fuss about giving him the domain admin account in front of Pam and him. I then loudly proclaimed that I was going to change the password to it since you can't have people who don't work for the company to have admin access to our network. I was overruled and was told to give it to him. I complied, but I also showed him multiple times how to change passwords on the domain. I even had him write it down to make sure that he could do it. I really stressed the importance of changing the admin password and deleting his local account the second he is no longer consulting with us to him. I showed him a few things, but nothing in regards to what really made the company run the day. There wasn't enough time in a year to bring this kid up to speed on how to run the place due to his complete ignorance of IT. I come into work the next day and sure enough I was let go, because her nephew had found my skills lacking in many areas. I collect my last paycheck and head home. The next morning I get a call from the CFO and owners. Apparently her nephew wasn't quite up to speed on everything we did there and she was graciously offering to pay me my regular salary to come in as a consultant and get her nephew up to speed on the IT infrastructure. I told her that I was now an independent contractor and if she wanted my services I was going to charge her $200 per hour with a 250-hour minimum. At that point she told me that she was going to call the police and have me arrested for what I did if I didn't come in and fix everything. My response was just so we're clear, you fired me, replaced me with a completely unqualified idiot, and now you're threatening to call the cops on me if I don't come in and fix what he did. I'll hold, please call the police and let me know what they said. She started cursing at me and hung up the phone. Turns out a nephew did actually learn something from me. He changed the admin password after I had left, the one that ran all the scripts for inventory, billing, shipping and ordering. According to some of my co-workers, the place was dead in the water for several days until they could get a real consultant in to go through the documentation that I had created and fix the issue. The nephew was immediately fired and Pam was gone within a month. Not my revenge, but my professor against cheaters.
Be gone!
I took the final for an engineering class this morning. Usually 1 or 2 people will go to the bathroom during class. However, for totally unknown reasons, about half of the class needed to use the restroom during the exam. Obviously, a vast majority of them were looking up the answers on their phones. This irritated me, but I just stayed focused and barely finished since it was a hard exam. I remembered that there was one particular problem that was only barely related to the stuff we went over in class, where part A was fairly easy, but I had no idea how to do part B. I didn't fret over it too much though, since that part was only 5 points out of 100. Well, our professor, who is on the older side and I would have thought was somewhat ignorant of technology, sent us an email just now explaining his diabolical plan to catch cheaters. Many of the students in this class use Chegg, a website that has answers to lots of homework questions if you're not familiar. To be fair, I have an account too, though I only used it for studying and checking homework solutions. Anyway, he explained that he was tired of people going to the bathroom and looking up answers on their phones, so he made the question I mentioned earlier as a trap. He purposely made part B impossible to solve, and about a month before the final, he got a Tay with a Chegg account to ask the exact question, which was distinctly worded to be unique. He then created his own Chegg account and answered the question with a bullshit solution that seems right at first glance, but is actually fundamentally flawed and very unlikely that someone would make the same assumptions and mistakes independently. He said that out of 99 exams, 14 of them fell for the trap, and that everyone who had his wrong solution on their exam was given a 0 and reported to the university for violating the academic honor pledge they signed on the front. He also sent an email to all the other professors in our department giving them the list of cheaters.
Do it!
Uncle bankrupts his previous employer.
Do it!
Not sure if this is petty or pro or whatever. You be the judge. My uncle is an Indian doctor. In the 90s there was a massive doctors shortage in Australia, so the government gave him citizenship. Unfortunately, you still had to sit 3 expensive exams to work as a doctor in Australia. These exams cost thousands of dollars, only happened twice a year, had limited sitting spots, times, and had arbitrary pass-fail marks. So many Indian doctors ended up becoming taxi drivers, small businessmen, etc. My uncle decided instead he would reapply and go through Australian medical school. Sure enough, being a doctor for 10+ years makes medical school easy, and my uncle was top of his class. He decided since he was already pushing 40+, had a family, he would apply to become a GP, family physician, instead of applying to be a surgeon like most of his teachers had suggested. At the time, many desperate foreign doctors were applying for GP residency. They would essentially get treated like crap. They would be forced to work and paid overtime. They would not be given proper study time or leave to sit mandatory exams. They would pocket the meals, accommodation, study, leave allowances that you were supposed to be paid by the training college. They would roster you to work every Saturday, Sunday shift, and if you refused they would give you a bad review and your training would be jeopardized. This mostly happened to foreign doctors, as most of them would be in bad debt and highly desperate for any sort of work. When my uncle graduated, he applied for GP training in a practice that is located within an Indian ethnic enclave so that he would have access to religious food, schools, etc. for the kids. Sure enough, this practice engaged in all of the above frickery. My uncle would work every single Saturday shift. During his dedicated study time, he would have to come into work. He got reprimanded for not overcharging patients in line with their framework. Worst of all, when my aunt was really sick and hospitalized, They wouldn't give him any time off to look after her and the kids. The owner of the clinic was a white GP who was openly racist against Indians, Asians and Aboriginal people, who were a large percentage of the clientele of this clinic. My uncle bided his 3 years, and as soon as his documentation came through making him a GP, he quit that instant. He went down to the local bank and got a loan to open up his own practice. All his old patients quickly moved with him to the new practice. The first year he struggled, but his practice quickly became known and word spread. Surprise, surprise, foreign-trained doctors actually work well and care about their patients if you actually care about them and give them appropriate wages, living conditions. More patients and more doctors looked to work with my uncle. Within 2 years my uncle had a GP practice that had 4 doctors, 2 nurses, 2 trainees and a manager. His practice easily rivaled his original teacher's. He then started 2 more GP practices with the money he was pulling in. These practices trapped his old teacher's clinic in a 2-kilometer triangle. He would advertise heavily and make sure he could take as much business from his old teacher as he could. Within 5 years his old teacher's practice went from hiring 6 doctors, 4 nurses and 6 trainees to just 1 doctor, his old teacher, and no one else. His old teacher tried to sell up his practice to other doctors, but no one would purchase it given how successful my uncle's 3 surrounding practices were. He then tried to sell it to my uncle, who refused to buy even at a ridiculously low sale price. Instead he waited for the bank to repossess his old teacher's clinic and then purchased it for a bit more money from the bank. My uncle then repurposed the building into his main offices from where he runs his other 3 practices. He made sure to redevelop his old boss's room into a staff toilet just as one final tribute to the human turd that was his old boss.
Catch me outside, how about that?